Hello, everybody. Today we'll be going over symmetric versus asymmetric encryption techniques, what the concepts are, how and when to use them, and overall why they are important in the field of cybersecurity and computer science. Now, let's just go right into it and let's just go over real quickly for those of you who aren't aware what encryption actually does and what it is. Now, it keeps people's data confidential, and what that means is that only those who are specifically authorized are able to read the data. Now, this helps when you're sending data, especially over a network, a public network such as the internet, or when you're storing data, such as in a database. Encryption usually is applied on some more sensitive data rather than the kind of data that is not sensitive but can still be harmful and used to conceal. It's more usually used for payment information and PII or personally identifiable information. And this is because the scalability and the usability of encryption makes reading data more difficult over time. So encryption is not usually used for every single type of data. Rather, it's just for the most sensitive data. But it is still used quite a lot. Now, it turns it into this incomprehensible nonsense. So it takes your credit card, let's say. It takes your credit card number and it turns it into like this jumbled mess of letters, numbers, and symbols in this incomprehensible format. It could even still be in the four numbers and then the four numbers and then the four numbers in the same form as a credit card. It can even still be just numbers. However, it won't be your credit card information anymore. It'll be a different number, a totally different number. It just depends on how the encryption is set up, and we'll get into all that later, such as format saving encryption in another lesson, since it's not relevant here, but I wanted you to be aware of it. And now the only way to make sense of this information is to have the correct decryption key. Now we'll get into what a decryption key actually is, but there are basically only two categories for encryption. There's symmetric and there's asymmetric, or the public and private key infrastructure. So PKI for short. Now symmetric encryption, it's pretty easy to understand what it actually is. It uses the same key for encryption and decryption. So you generate one key, and then you encrypt the data, and then you send the data, and then you somehow have to get the key to the other party. Now that's more easily said than done. However, symmetric encryption is only used for bigger amounts of data. So theoretically, you could send an encrypted key using symmetric encryption, but that's not really the point because you still have to get the key there. Now, anyone with that key can read the data. Now, that makes it somewhat vulnerable to man in the middle attacks. If you can grab the data off of the network, despite it being encrypted, if you don't use a really strong encryption and decryption key, then an attacker can easily brute force or just simply try to guess the key if it is based on a dictionary word or something like that. More often than not, it's more a group of bits than an actual word, but there are examples of both. Usually it's a group of bits. Now, an attacker can brute force this, and the number of possibilities of your key is 2 to the number of bits that you are using for your key. So if you use a 128-bit key, you have a possibility of 2 to the 128 possibilities of what that key actually is. Now that's pretty difficult to brute force. It could take several days or even several months sometimes with the bigger keys. making attacks like that somewhat infeasible, as by the time you get the data and actually break the key for the data, the actual message will become unusable and out of date. So, like, say that you need some type of information for the big bank hack that you have going on March 31st, and the bank CEO sent some message that you think will help you out with that. Now, he's using a 512-bit key based on the Advanced Encryption Standard, AES. Now, you want to brute force that key. Well, that's going to take you quite a while to actually brute force, unless you have a supercomputer. But even still, you don't have the resources to do that in a measly amount of time. So you'll probably break it by next year. But I digress. Now, a couple examples of symmetric algorithms are AES, like I've said, that's Advanced Encryption Standard. Now that uses some, I believe the standard is 256 bits for a key. I could be wrong. It could be 128 or even 192 bits, or one of the three. I believe it's either one of the three or 128 or 256, if I remember correctly. Now that is basically what everyone uses. Everyone uses AES because it's so strong and so computationally easy to get to work. You could basically just put it on a microchip on your computer and have it run AES algorithms all day. It's so easy. DES is a little outdated. Uh, it's kind of the predecessor to AES. It was the standard for a very long time, but DES is not supposed to be used anymore because it's able to be attacked not by brute force means, but by statistical means, where you can basically decrypt the message without the key, which is incredibly dangerous. And if you can create a statistical attack against it, you can break it in a very small amount of time. Depends on a couple of variables, and I won't get into that right now. More often, DES is used for triple DES, which is still kind of used, but kind of not. Triple DES uses 3 different keys. I'll explain that in more detail when I go over DES and triple DES in more detail in another lecture. I just wanted you to be aware of it. OTP, or one-time pad, is a bit of an outlier when it comes to symmetric algorithms. It's used for more government agencies because each time you want to send a message, you have to use a completely different key that you have never used before. Now, that means that you have to create a million keys for each person that you want to talk to using this method. So more often than not, they would have code books and they would send what key to use to an agent in the field when they send out the information. They would send out a key to use via some different method, and it would contain a number in the code book, and then the agent in the field will use that key to decrypt the one message that they got and never use that key ever again. And then they would pick at random a completely separate key. It's not an incremental 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Use these keys in this order. No, it's usually like use 46, now use 79, now use 156. It's selected at seemingly random, but both parties have to know what key to use to encrypt and decrypt. OTP is the most secure because you can't use the key more than once. So even if you do break it, it won't matter for a different message altogether. So moving on, we have an example of how symmetric encryption works, and I made this in beautiful PowerPoint icons. Now, on the left here, you could see a computer, and on the right, you could see a receiver. Now, I'll name the one on the left Alice and the one on the right Bob for ease of explanation. So Alice has some plain text or a message that she wants to send to Bob. Now, she uses their shared secret key, as they have agreed on before this conversation, to encrypt the data in transit, which is that blue arrow in the middle. It is called ciphertext. That's that garbage, you can't read this because I encrypted it. And then once Bob gets it, he uses that same key that Alice used to encrypt the plain text to decrypt it. Now, there's some problems with this model, as in, how do you get the secret key to Bob? How does Alice do that? Well, there's a couple ways you can do that. And one of the most popular is to use asymmetric encryption. Now, asymmetric encryption is pretty interesting, as it uses two different keys. It uses one for encryption and one for decryption, meaning that you can only use the encryption key for encryption and decryption key for decryption. More often than not, these are called public and private keys. Everyone should know your public key. It's not sensitive information or anything. However, your private key, only you should have your private key. This is because people can pretend to be you. Now, it might not seem like a big deal right now, but as you begin to understand the importance of keeping your private key secure, people can create transactions in your name, do malicious activities such as hacking under your name, create digital certificates under your name. It's just a whole mess of things. Asymmetric encryption, because it's so slow, due to the fact that it's mathematically kind of advanced for some algorithms, it's used for smaller amounts of data, which is perfect for key proliferation. Now, the person with the private key can only decrypt things that are encrypted with the public key, and vice versa. If I encrypt something with my private key, you can decrypt it with my public key. So if I encrypt one with a private key, you can decrypt it with a public key. If I encrypt it with a public key, you can decrypt it with a private key. Just use the opposite for decryption. Now, only the person who has the private key can effectively authenticate themselves, unless someone else has broken their private key, which would be completely unfortunate. Now, normally what people do, now I have a picture for this, but I wasn't very good at making things in MS Paint, so it may take some time for me to explain. But anyway, let's go over some examples of asymmetric algorithms. RSA, which is a kind of going out of style by now, but is still a major player in the markets. RSA is a type of asymmetric algorithms wherein you encrypt your symmetric key in order to be sent over to the other party. Elliptic curve cryptography is kind of a new player in that it came out in the last 15 years. I can't remember the exact day, but it's relatively new. And basically, it just generates a curve, and it selects a public key and a private key based on a tangent line. It's a little too advanced for my blood. I don't know. I wasn't very good at math, but I could explain it if I had the time. But let's go on. Let's go right to the picture. So here's a asymmetric example only. Now, there's a couple problems with this example as well, but we'll get into that after I fully explain what it does. Now, let's keep going with the Alice and Bob example. Alice is on the left, Bob is on the right. Now, Alice wants to send another bit of plain text, but she wants it to be more secure. She wants to make sure that only Bob can read this. So, Alice encrypts the message with her public key. Now, this ensures that Alice encrypts the plain text with Bob's public key. Everyone knows Bob's public key. Since she encrypted it with Bob's public key, after he gets it through transit, he can decrypt it with his private key. Now, only Bob has his private key. Now, and that ensures that in transit, someone can't grab the ciphertext and decrypt it with the public key. And that basically ensures that a man in the middle attack is not feasible by any means because of the two different key scenario. However, there's a big problem with this. It takes a while for the plain text to actually encrypt itself using a public key, and it takes a while to decrypt it using the private key. It's computationally difficult. Not so difficult that it'll take forever, but it's not preferred over symmetric encryption because of how long it would take and how much data is actually created in the process. So what normally happens is that, and I wish I had a picture here, but like I said before, my MS Paint skills are not as good as I remembered them. And fitting all this on one slide is difficult, to say the least. So what normally happens is Alice encrypts something using her shared secret key. Then she takes that shared secret key as the plain text in this example. She encrypts the shared secret key with Bob's public key, for example. She sends over the encrypted shared secret key over to Bob, along with the original message that she encrypted with the symmetric key. Now, Bob decrypts the key with his private key in order to get the original symmetric key. Then he uses that symmetric key to decrypt the plain text, and then it's readable. That is the best way to guarantee not only speed and computational efficiency, but also confidentiality, as you need both Bob's private key and the few bits of ciphertext in order to completely read everything. And since Bob's private key is never sent over the network and never should be sent over the network, it'll be pretty hard to actually break that key. Now, that was just a simple example. You can get into much more advanced topics using these algorithms. But I just wanted to make sure that these concepts were drilled into your mind. And that's all I have for you today. And I hope you learned something new. Have a good day.